Hi, town meeting members. This is Julie Hackett, Superintendent of Schools, and I am going to share the recommended FY21 school department budget with you. Before I get started, I wanted to mention that the budget was conceived of before the school closure came into effect. So the budget you're about to hear doesn't reflect unanticipated needs due to the COVID-19 pandemic. One way that we're handling the future is to think about how we can curtail spending now so that we can have more resources available should we need them. And before I get started, I wanted to also point out that this budget serves 7,300 wonderful students in the Lexington Public Schools, and to showcase the talents of our students, they help us with the artwork in this presentation on the first and last slides, as you'll see, and also in our budget book. So a shout out to our young people. We begin with school committee FY21 budget guidelines. Each year, the school committee indicates to the superintendent of schools what is a priority as far as they're concerned, and then we work the budget process to reflect as much of those priorities as we possibly can. There are 14 priorities in the FY21 budget guidelines. I just want to call your attention to 3 of them. The number 11, later school start times, number 12, LPS strategic and master plans, and number 14, elementary and middle school redistricting. So we have worked through later school start times and through redistricting in the past 2 years. We have a plan ready to go. That plan will be in place whether we are in school in a traditional sense or in a remote learning format. And some of the budget priorities reflect the needs around later school start times and redistricting. And also, I'm very excited to share with you that we have a strategic plan in place and a master plan in its final stages. So our budget guideline number 12 is well underway, along with 11 and 14 and many of the others that you see on this screen. Each year, the town of Lexington has a collaborative budget summit process. The meetings start in October and they carry on through February. Usually there are around 4 budget summits. This year we had 5, as we had to sort through the revenue allocation. And this is a process that we really appreciate on the school department side because it's helpful to hear the impacts from a town perspective and to hear what our constituents have to say. So much appreciation to the Board of Selectmen, the school committee, obviously the appropriation committee, the capital expenditures committee, the town manager, and to everyone involved in the collaborative process. I wanted to talk briefly about enrollment projections, and this is specific to the high school for a purpose. Typically, we share with you the total enrollment projections. We're not going to do that in this presentation because the primary emphasis right now is on Lexington High School. Our elementary numbers and our middle school numbers are relatively stable. We're seeing a spike in the numbers at the high school level. And just wanted to talk a little bit about the process we've used to come up with the numbers. And that process involved an enrollment working group who worked with our director of planning. The enrollment working group is a group of residents who have expertise in using statistics to do enrollment projections. We used a hybrid cohort survival method to come up with the calculations, and they had a 90% confidence interval rate, which is very good, obviously, and it means that we can predict with some accuracy what the numbers are going to be in enrollment in the next 5 years, barring, of course, any unforeseen natural disasters or difficult challenges like a recession that we saw in 2009. And so when these enrollment projections were made, we didn't know about a pandemic, of course. What we should be thinking about as we consider these numbers is that something like a pandemic can have a significant impact on the economy, as we know, and already economists are forecasting that we're going to have more challenging economic times than we did even in 2009. So we anticipate that these numbers are going to fluctuate in some way. They could either go up or down. In the recession that happened in 2009, the numbers actually were reduced in terms of enrollment. And the assumption is that that had something to do with the high cost of living and whether or not people could afford the expense of living in the community, that kind of thing. What could also happen, conversely, is that the numbers could go up. You could see, for example, students who are in private schools returning to public schools. We don't have many students in that particular situation in our community, but it is something to keep an eye on. What we know for sure is that our current numbers are at about 2,300 students, as you can see from the chart. And then the tails that you see are the projections. So the orange is kind of right in the middle. What we anticipate that we'll see by 2025 is an enrollment of about 2,500 plus students. If they are on the high side, you'll see the green tail, which is about 2,579, and on the low side would be the purple tail, which is about 2,449. So what we know is that we're looking at increases in enrollment of somewhere around 250, 300 students in the next 5 years. And it could be higher and it could be lower, but already the pressure is great in terms of the overcrowding at the high schools, even if the enrollment were to stay the same. So we do have a statement of interest into the Massachusetts School Building Authority. We are definitely hoping that that statement of interest will advance, particularly in light of social distancing concerns and the like, and we'll keep our eye on the enrollment figures and update regularly to the community. This slide is intended to give you the big picture of how we arrive at our FY 2021 revenue allocation model, and this essentially comes from the agreements that were made during Summit 2A. And we start on the municipal side with a projected revenue, or the town side, I should say, with a projected revenue of 237.4 million roughly. And when you take out the municipal base and the school base and you factor in the shared costs, you're left with an FY21 available growth revenue of about 6.5 million. And what that means is that's the money that we have to work with. And the way that things happen in Lexington is it's divvied up by a percentage that has been historically the percentage used. And I think that's a process that works really well. So 26% of that 6.5 million goes to the municipal side, and about 74% goes to the school side. And then you see the split of 1.7 to about $4.8 million. And next, we just get a finer look at that perspective from the school side with the $113.5 million FY20 base that I mentioned, which gives us the growth revenue of about 4.27%, and that's that 4.8 million extra. We have to factor in a transfer to municipal for benefits. So in terms of the 3 additional full-time equivalents that you'll see in this budget presentation, we have to pay roughly $50,000, just under $50,000 for benefits. So we back that number out of the 4.853, and then we arrive at the school department FY21 appropriation of about $4.8 million. And with the benefits backed out, that takes that 4.27% and it makes it 4.23%, reduces it according to the benefits for a total of $118.4 million approximately. Next, we have a view of the new growth revenue allocation and its uses. So on the top, for example, you see the sources of revenue, which derived from our allocations. So we have 113.5 million on the base budget. the growth revenue of about 4.8 million. We get at that 4.27%. And then we've listed out where that 4.8 million goes. The uses of it include money spent on contractual increases. And in this slide, we see 2.41%. So that is the amount, that 2.7 million or 2.41%, just to continue with the positions that we have. And it is not considering the new positions that we'll talk about, and there are very few of them, but you'll see that percentage change in a moment. And then we also have money for legal mandates, and that money is about 1.6 million that we are proposing in this budget, or just about 1.5%. We also have to add full-time equivalents for enrollment increases, and then we have some very minor program improvements at about $67,000, and that comes to a total of 4.8 million, and 4.27% is the total amount for the allocation, less the 49,000 for the benefits. This is a more nuanced look at the summary of FY21 position changes. And the big story on this slide is that after you take into account all different sorts of things in terms of how you run a school system, and in terms of the full-time equivalents that are necessary to do that, program improvements, etc., we have a net of 3.19 FTEs. And 3.19 FTEs is a little bit more than 3 additional bodies than we had in previous years. We've seen that number considerably higher. In fact, that number in the past has sometimes been in the double digits, and sometimes that's driven by enrollment. Other times that's just driven by particular needs. So you may have children who have IEPs that are involved and they need more supports, things of that nature. But this is certainly the most conservative full-time equivalent addition to the budget that we have seen in many, many years in the Lexington Public Schools. We break this formula down to base budget, enrollment, and mandates, and we've embedded the program improvements, as you'll see in a moment. So in the base, these are just the changes that you can see year to year that happen in particular areas. So for example, we need a quarter of a position for English, 9 through 12 English next year. And we are losing 7.6 full-time equivalents in special education. And what anybody managing a school budget should look for is changes like this, because the budget shouldn't look the same from year to year. You should be analyzing what are the actual needs, how can we make changes, how can we be more conservative in areas where are unmet needs, and those should be addressed in that way. And as you consider all those categories, the base total was reduced by 8.62 full-time equivalents. So just under 9 positions were cut, which is more significant and substantial than in years past. And that is also why when we get to the net of 3.19 FTEs, it's smaller than in most years. We next consider enrollment, and we consider enrollment K-12 for the regular education program, as well as pre-K 22 special education. And the print shop could be considered a program improvement. You could categorize it that way. We put it under enrollment because there was a long-standing agreement that indicated that print shop would be increased by a certain amount of full-time equivalents as the student population increased and demands increased. And one thing to keep in mind is the print shop services both the municipal side and the school side, and we're adding just under a quarter of a position. Not even a quarter of a position. And then last but not least, we have mandates. So for the pre-K 22 special education, we see that we have about 7.9 full-time equivalents that we need in addition to what we had. So some needs go out, some needs are added, and we account for them in the way that I'm describing now. And then finally, we have a very small need. This could also be considered a program need around K-12 PE, health, and wellness. We put it under mandates because this relates to servicing a student's 504 plan. And then all of that brings us to the grand total of 3.19 FTE. So as we look at budget growth, the school committee recommended budget based on the adjustments that were made during Summit 4, and I'll talk about that in a bit, break down in the following way. And I want you to look at the salary and wages line way to the left and expenses, and we'll talk a little bit about how much has increased and the percentage of increase. So under salaries and wages, we have approximately a $3.4 million increase, and you can see the numbers that were actual budgeted versus recommended in FY21, which was just under 99 million in FY21. And that brings us to a percent increase of about 3.66%. Remember, in previous slides, I shared with you a percentage increase that was around 2 point something percent. That difference in contractual increases is due to the fact that we didn't have our 3.19 additional FTE accounted for in the salary and wages. The other important thing to know about salary and wages is that that comprises approximately 84% of our budget. So it's a very big portion of the pie. In contrast, the expenses are a very small portion of the pie, say 16% of the total $118 million recommended budget. And that's why that percentage looks bigger than what you might normally expect to see. So we're only looking at increasing the expense line by 1.3 million. Obviously, any change on a smaller number that is greater has an impact on the percentage increase. So 7.25% is not a big number. What's important to know is sometimes that number is anywhere between 9 to 11%, and it's driven by transportation costs, inflation for out-of-district programs, and things of that nature. Many often wonder about how Lexington compares to other communities in our area or communities that are similar to us. So we've given you some data here to help you draw your own conclusions about comparison. There are several different districts. In the left-hand column, the data are pulled from the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Schools net school spending and the Chapter 70 district profiles. And what we've done is we've taken the actual net school spending figures for 2009, compared them to 2019 actual net school spending figures. So that's a span of 10 years to be able to say, how much was our per pupil adjusted budget growth within that 10 years? In other words, are we spending radically more, substantially less? How do we compare to other systems? And if you look in the second column from the right, you will see that Lexington is about 28.7%, which is on the lower end of things, maybe more toward the middle in some cases. The lowest is Winchester with 22%. The highest is Burlington with 62%. Lexington is about 28%. So we are right in the ballpark in terms of our spending over time when it's adjusted for the per pupil growth. And then we also included data from 2019, and those are per pupil spending numbers. So there's a formula the state uses to make sure that school systems have an apples to apples comparison. And Lexington spends about $17,600, for each student, compared to Cambridge, who spends about $28,000 per student. And then you see some other districts who are much smaller than us who spend about $13,000 per student. So again, Lexington is right about in the middle of that list of comparison districts when we consider per pupil expenditures. I wanted to share a little bit about our budget journey this year because some of you may have followed the summits and may have questions about how we arrived at our recommended allocation. And something important to know is that we came in with a Lexington Public Schools budget estimate of about $119 million. And then the Summit 1 allocation came in at about $117.6 million. So we were looking at a delta of about $1.5 million. And what that meant was that we went back to the drawing board in terms of what amount of allocation we would be getting. And fortunately, we were able to increase that Summit 2A allocation by $737,000. And then we also went back to the drawing board in terms of further reductions we could make in the Lexington Public Schools budget, proposed budget, so that we could winnow down that delta a bit more. And we were able to find $785,000 or so in additional reductions. So that brought our LPS allocation for FY21 to $118.4 million. How did we close the $1.5 million gap? First of all, we had an increase in the allocation from the Summit 1 benchmark. We had total base staffing reductions of about 9.32 full-time equivalents, and that is a pretty significant number when you compare it to previous years. We also took a look at the special education out-of-district placement budget, and our system or method for keeping an eye on special education so that we're not hit with surprise costs is that we have different lists to track student needs. We have a high-risk list and we have a watch list. And we were able to reduce one of the line items by $368,000. This is for high-risk students by removing them and pushing them to a watch list. So our high risk anticipates that their needs are higher and they're more likely to be urgent, and the watch list says these are needs that we may have. So the watch list is kind of less impactful, obviously, than the high risk list. We had 2 students removed to the watch list from the high risk list. And then we identified changes in cost shares for 1 student, and then potential placement option tuitions for 3 students, which further reduced our costs. It presents us with some risk, but what's important to know is that we have the Special Education Stabilization Fund should we need additional funding, and that would require us to go to town meeting members and ask for permission to use those funds. So that's how we closed the $1.5 million gap. And we also have some additional cost saving measures to share. Under the legal line, for example, we reduced that line item by a total of $47,000 approximately. I also wanted to share with you that we have, in the last 2 years, reduced that by about $150,000, the legal line. So we've been doing a good job keeping our eye on that and using resources wisely. So instead of calling for individual legal advice, what we do is we make sure that we're sharing information. We make sure that we have gatekeepers on access to legal, and that's been an effective way to reduce the legal line. We also reduced a number of positions in personnel by not backfilling positions. So just because someone left a job doesn't necessarily mean that that job has to be filled. And we were very scrupulous when it came to requests to fill a position. That enabled us to save $113,000. We managed to do a few consolidations as well. So in finance, special education, human resources, we were able to combine positions and save a total of $84,000. In transportation, we were able to find savings both in regular day transportation as well as special education transportation. We saved $133,000 in regular day transportation and about $71,000 in special education transportation. And lastly, we reduced the strategic planning money that we were recommending by $84,000 So that was how we arrived at a more economical budget or proposed budget. That concludes the budget presentation. And I also wanted to share with you, for those of you who are interested anyway, this We All Belong song. We were hoping this year to have the Harrington students that you'll see in this video, along with their teacher, Angela Carpenter, who's a fantastic music teacher. We were hoping to bring them to you live and in person, and they could share the song that their music teacher created about our Lexington Public Schools core values. Unfortunately, we can't be with you in person, but that doesn't mean we can't share the great work that our students do. So if you get a chance, please watch the video. We were actually honoring an outgoing school committee member on the video at a school committee meeting at the end of February. And it's really touching, and we hope that it reflects the wonderful children that we have in our school system and the great work that happens every day in the Lexington Public Schools. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions at our virtual town meeting, and be well. Thank you.